Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are slipping quietly into a part of medieval life that rarely makes it into textbooks or movies, yet shaped the daily reality of kings, queens, and anyone close to power. We often imagine the Middle Ages as a world of heroic battles, grand castles, and dramatic legends. But beneath all that pageantry was an atmosphere of subtle tension. Life at the top looked glorious from a distance, but the closer you were to the throne, the more you understood that even ordinary moments carried invisible risks. And nowhere was this more true than at the royal dining table. So find a comfortable spot, settle in, and let us begin with a truth that might surprise you. For medieval rulers, every meal was a test of trust. Picture a royal feast, the kind you have seen in paintings or historical films. Long tables covered with roasted meats, baskets of fruit, pewter cups filled with wine, servants hurrying between benches while musicians play in the background. But imagine that behind all this warmth and celebration lived a quiet, persistent question: is this safe to eat? For us, food is comfort. For medieval rulers, it was a calculated risk, shaped by politics, shifting alliances, rivalries, and the simple reality that controlling a person's meal was one of the most discreet ways to influence their fate. In an age when sudden illness was common, when fevers arrived overnight with no explanation, and when medical knowledge was limited, it was not always possible to distinguish chance from intention. A single meal could trigger days of whispered speculation. To understand how deep this anxiety ran, imagine the process that unfolded before a king even sat down. A team of trusted servants checked ingredients. Dishes were monitored from the moment they were prepared. Utensils were inspected. And at the heart of it all was the food taster, a person whose job was to take the first bite and weight an individual simultaneously honored and placed in harm's way. Only after the taster gave a nod of approval could the ruler raise the spoon. This was not a symbolic ritual. It was survival wrapped in ceremony. Even at the height of their authority, medieval rulers lived with the constant awareness that danger did not always come from the battlefield or the throne room. Sometimes it came quietly, disguised as a gift of hospitality or a simple bowl of stew. Court politics shifted rapidly. A noble who smiled today might be planning a power play tomorrow. A rival might prefer subtlety over open rebellion. And because the threat was invisible, every meal carried its own tension. Step into a medieval kitchen for a moment. The room is warm, full of the smells of roasting meat and herbs. Servants move quickly from one task to another. Yet beneath this normal rhythm is an unspoken understanding. The kitchen holds enormous influence. A missing jar of spices, a new servant, a dish that tastes slightly different. Any of these could set off a spark of suspicion. And while not every sudden illness was the result of foul play, the fear itself was enough to shape behavior. The distinction between natural sickness and deliberate harm was blurry. And in a world without modern science, doubt filled the gaps. This environment created a unique kind of psychological pressure. Food, which should have been comforting, became something that demanded caution. The simple act of eating required trust. Trust in the kitchen staff. Trust in the taster. Trust in the supply chain that brought ingredients into the castle. Rulers became extremely selective about who could prepare their food, who could carry plates, who could stand near the table. In some courts, only specific families were allowed to work in the kitchen. In others, guards kept watch at all hours. Some rulers even changed meal times or locations without warning to limit opportunities for interference. Foreign diplomacy became complicated as well. An invitation to dine with another ruler was both an honor and a potential risk. Accepting meant placing your well-being in someone else's hands. Declining could be seen as an insult. Behind every banquet was a delicate dance of courtesy, caution, and quiet evaluation. What looked like a simple dinner might have been a moment of intense political calculation. This atmosphere of uncertainty did not stay confined to the palace. News traveled slowly in the Middle Ages, and rumors often arrived before facts. When someone in power suddenly became ill, people in distant villages whispered stories they did not fully understand. A noble collapses at a feast, and days later, someone miles away hears a distorted retelling. A diplomat falls sick while visiting a foreign court, and speculation fills the blanks. The public did not have access to medical explanations or trustworthy reports, so stories grew on their own. Conspiracy thinking was not fringe. It was a coping mechanism in a world full of unanswered questions. And in many cases, fear had real consequences. A strange flavor in a dish might cause a ruler to refuse the meal entirely. A cup of wine that looked too dark might be pushed aside. Even loyal servants could come under suspicion simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The emotional cost of living in this environment is something we rarely consider today. Power made you visible, respected, and obeyed, but it also isolated you. The more influence you had, the more carefully you had to guard yourself, not only from rivals, but from the very people you depended on. This climate of caution led to practices that resemble modern safety protocols. Ingredients were checked. Tools were locked away. Dishes were observed at multiple points. Staff rotations prevented close alliances from forming. The idea that process prevents danger became part of royal kitchen culture long before scientific food safety existed. Ironically, some of the earliest forms of risk management were not created in laboratories. They were created in kitchens by people trying to protect the most important figure in the realm. Yet despite all these precautions, no ruler ever erased the underlying anxiety. Knowledge was limited, records were incomplete, and science had not yet caught up with the mysteries of illness. When information is scarce, the mind fills the gaps. And that, more than anything, is why meals carried such symbolic weight. They were not just about nourishment. They were about vulnerability. Sitting at the dining table meant lowering your guard, even for a moment, and trusting that the world around you would not take advantage. This vulnerability shaped leadership. A cautious ruler might become more suspicious, more defensive, or more protective of their inner circle. Policies could be influenced by personal fears. Advisors who felt threatening might be dismissed. Those who inspired confidence might rise quickly. Decisions we interpret today as overly strict or overly cautious were often rooted in a genuine fear of unseen danger. So when we imagine a medieval king lifting a spoonful of soup, we are not just witnessing someone enjoying a meal. We are watching a moment heavy with history, ritual, and quiet resilience. It reminds us that power is not only about strength and authority. It is also about navigating a world where information is incomplete, motives are hidden, and the smallest moment, something as simple as taking a bite, can carry the weight of trust. In a world lit by torches and filled with whispered to schemes, the dining table became a symbol of both luxury and fragility. And in that fragile space, medieval rulers learned a truth that still echoes centuries later. Trust is powerful, trust is dangerous, and trust, sometimes, is the most delicate ingredient in the room. If the royal dining hall was a place where fear quietly slipped into daily life, then the forests of medieval Europe were where whispers grew into legends. After leaving the torchlit walls of the castle and stepping into the broad, open night, you would find yourself surrounded by a vast and untamed world, one that held its own secrets, stories, and communities that lived beyond the reach of kings and priests. And tonight, as we continue this journey into the hidden side of medieval life, we are stepping into those woods. The forest was more than a place of trees. It was a world of shadows and traditions, where old beliefs lingered long after official religion tried to erase them. And scattered across this landscape were small groups who practiced rituals passed down from their ancestors, rituals meant to protect crops, heal the sick, understand nature, or simply keep the memories of the old ways alive. These were not sinister cults or dark gatherings, despite what later stories might claim. They were communities of people trying to survive in a world where nature was often harsh and unpredictable. Imagine a clearing lit only by the pale glow of the moon. A circle of villagers, women, men, elders, stand together, holding bundles of herbs, grains, or small carved symbols. They chant softly, not to summon anything frightening, but to offer thanks for a harvest, to pray for rain, or to ask for protection during winter. To them, the forest is not a place of fear. It is a sanctuary, a refuge, a part of life older than any cathedral. But to the medieval church, any belief that did not come from its teachings felt like a threat. And so these gatherings, even the most harmless ones, grew into objects of suspicion. Priests warned villagers not to wander into the woods at night. Noblemen ordered patrols to look for strange gatherings. And slowly, rumors grew, whispers that something strange, something unholy, lived under the trees. In reality, what lived there were people holding on to traditions that had existed long before the church arrived. Traditions centered around nature, seasons, and community. But in an age where anything outside the established order felt dangerous, misunderstandings flourished. Take the Benandanti of northern Italy, for example. They believed that on certain nights their spirits left their bodies to protect their fields from harm. To them, it was an act of service, a way of safeguarding the harvest that everyone depended on. But when the church questioned them, hoping to uncover confessions of dark practices, the Benandanti explained their beliefs calmly, insisting they meant no harm. Their sincerity did not protect them. Their traditions were simply too unusual, too unfamiliar, and eventually, they were absorbed into accusations of superstition. And their story was not unique. Across Europe, pockets of folk practitioners existed: herbal healers, storytellers, bone setters, and spiritual guides who understood plants, weather patterns, and rituals as naturally as others understood farming or weaving. These people were not trying to replace religion or defy authority. They were carrying knowledge rooted in centuries of living close to nature. They knew which herb eased a cough, which root calmed a fever, which plant helped a laboring mother breathe more easily. In many villages, they were invaluable. But because their knowledge did not come from the church, it was often misunderstood. When someone recovered after receiving herbal treatment, praise. When someone did not, the healer became suspicious. When a village survived a harsh winter thanks to communal rituals, it was luck. When it did not, whispers began. What happened in the woods? Who was there? What did they do? All it took was one bad season, one untimely storm, or one unexplained illness for fear to spread. To understand how easily fear took root, you have to imagine the mindset of medieval people. Life was fragile. A single drought or early frost could threaten an entire year's food supply. A strange sickness could sweep through a town in days. And when people do not have scientific explanations, they turn to stories, symbols, and patterns, some comforting, others frightening. If a group met quietly in the woods to practice rituals, some villagers saw devoted neighbors trying to help the community. Others, especially those influenced by sermons about sin and danger, saw secrecy and shadows and filled in the rest with imagination. The unknown became frightening simply because it was unknown. But if you strip away the centuries of rumor, the core truth remains. These groups were not plotting harm. They were preserving older understandings of the world's cyclical time, seasonal balance, herbal knowledge, and the belief that nature itself held meaning. Their rituals were often gentle, symbolic, and passed down through generations. They kept songs that described how to read the sky, stories that taught survival, and traditions that helped people feel connected to the land. And yet, the deeper we look into medieval history, the more we see how easily misunderstanding turned into accusation. There are records of villagers being questioned for leaving food near ancient trees as offerings, though the act may have simply been part of a seasonal celebration. Women who gathered at night to share herbs and remedies became suspects, even if their gatherings were just attempts to support each other. Farmers who practiced old harvest rites were labeled as followers of forgotten gods, even when they considered themselves faithful members of the community. In some cases, entire local traditions were reinterpreted as dangerous because they did not fit neatly into official doctrine. A circle dance meant to celebrate spring might be seen as suspicious. A chant passed down from ancestors might be treated as forbidden. A simple moment of gratitude under the moon might be mistaken for something ominous. And so the forest, once a place of comfort and connection, gradually became a symbol of mystery, partly because of genuine secrecy and partly because of the stories people told about it. But here's the fascinating part. Despite warnings, despite surveillance, despite occasional accusations, many of these practices survived. Not openly, and not loudly, but quietly, in the background of daily life. Some rituals blended into Christian festivals. Some became family traditions. Some survived only in fragments, in charms, in old songs, in patterns carved into wooden tools. They lived on because they were useful, meaningful, or simply comforting. And in that survival, we see something important. The medieval world was not divided neatly between official religion and forbidden beliefs. It was a blending of many layers, old and new, folk and formal, spoken and unspoken. People did not see themselves as rebels or outsiders. They were simply navigating life with the tools they had, trying to understand the seasons, protect their families, and honor the world around them. What later generations would call cults or secret societies were often nothing more than small communities trying to connect with nature, preserve ancestral knowledge, or face uncertainty together. They were not meeting to threaten kingdoms, they were meeting to survive. And as we walk through that moonlit clearing in our imagination, watching villagers whisper ancient words or raise their hands to the night sky, we begin to understand why these traditions mattered. They offered a sense of continuity in a world filled with change. They created community in times of fear. They gave people a feeling of control when fate seemed unpredictable. The forest was not just a place of mystery. It was a living diary of human resilience. And in many ways, those quiet gatherings, those whispered rituals, those moments of connection in the dark, tell us as much about the medieval world as any grand cathedral or royal decree ever could. As we step away from the moonlit forest and back toward the world of stone walls and echoing halls, the next chapter of medieval secrecy leads us into a place that seems, at first glance, peaceful and detached from worldly concerns. The monastery. Today we imagine monasteries as places of quiet prayer, candlelit manuscripts, and men devoted to solitude. But in the Middle Ages, monasteries were far more than spiritual havens. They were hubs of literacy, centers of travel, keepers of records, and, though history often whispers this part rather than declaring it, they were also the closest thing medieval Europe had to a network of intelligence gatherers. Not spies in the dramatic sense, but observers, listeners, scribes who recorded more than prayers. And tonight, as we continue unraveling the hidden layers of medieval life, we are stepping through the heavy wooden doors of one of those cloistered worlds. Imagine a monastery at dawn. Mist settles over the fields. Bells echo through cold air. Monks in simple robes file quietly into the chapel, chanting softly, their voices rising and falling like waves. It looks serene, almost untouched by the rest of society. But behind the tranquility lies something more intricate. Monks were not isolated from the world. They were connected to it in ways ordinary villagers could never be. They traveled between towns and cities. They heard confessions from peasants, nobles, and sometimes even royalty. They exchanged letters. They translated documents. And because so few people could read or write, monks were often the only ones capable of preserving and transmitting information. Knowledge was their currency. And in a world where information meant power, that placed monasteries at the center of countless hidden conversations. Picture a monk on a journey, a satchel over his shoulder, a rolled parchment tied with string, sandals dusty from miles of travel. He is greeted warmly by villagers, because monks are trusted figures. He listens to their stories, hears their fears, learns about disputes, harvest failures, illnesses, quarrels, and occasionally dangerous whispers. When he arrives at his monastery, these experiences become part of a larger web of knowledge. He might write a letter to another monastery describing the political mood of a town. He might send a report to a bishop. He might summarize rumors that seem important, not out of malice, but out of duty. Monasteries saw themselves as guardians of order, and to guard order, they believed they needed to stay informed. This flow of information eventually reached powerful ears. Kings relied on monasteries, not just for spiritual guidance, but for news. A monastery might send word that a noble family was gathering too many armed men. Another might report that a particular region was restless. Others might notice unfamiliar merchants passing through, or ships docking with unusual goods. Monks rarely acted alone. They were part of a network, an early, quiet version of a communication system that stretched across borders, languages, and cultures. And the most private information did not come from travel. It came from confession. Medieval confession was far more expansive than what we imagine today. People confessed fear, anger, frustration with their lords, resentment toward taxes, doubts about alliances, suspicions about neighbors, worries about famine, and even political opinions they would not dare say in public. They whispered these words, believing they were speaking to a representative of the divine. The monk listened, offered forgiveness, and sometimes quietly noted patterns. If 15 villagers in the same region confessed anxiety about an upcoming harvest, that signaled risk. If several nobles expressed distrust toward the king, that suggested unrest. If someone hinted that a rival was gathering followers, the monk could not ignore it. These were not just spiritual concerns. They were clues about the health of society. Kings understood this better than anyone. Many rulers kept monks close, not primarily for their prayers, but for their insight. A monk could walk through a village without raising suspicion. A monk could ask questions no soldier or official could ask. A monk could sit in a marketplace and listen, and when he returned to the king, his observations carried weight. They were seen as honest, unembellished, and free from political ambition. Whether that was always true is another question, but the perception made monasteries incredibly influential. This influence grew because monasteries were also safe houses for letters. A noble might send a message to another noble through a monk, knowing it would be delivered discreetly. A bishop might pass information to a king under the guise of spiritual reporting. Even merchants sought monasteries as secure points along trade routes. Because monks were not supposed to engage in worldly greed, they were seen as trustworthy carriers. This perception allowed them to move information across Europe with surprising speed. And then there is the part of the story that feels almost cinematic. Some monasteries acted as subtle enforcers for powerful families. A monk might be asked to deliver a warning, negotiate quietly, or discourage a conflict before it exploded. Again, not in the dramatic sense of shadowy figures wearing cloaks, but in small, understated actions that shaped decisions. A conversation at a bedside. A message delivered at dusk. A reminder that someone knows. These were soft tools of influence, but in a fragile society, soft tools could be incredibly effective. What makes this especially fascinating is how seamlessly spiritual and political roles blended. A monk was not trying to manipulate. He believed he was protecting order. If a noble's ambition threatened peace, advising caution was not just political, it was moral. If villagers were frightened, reporting it felt like an act of service. If rumors of conflict began spreading, delivering that information upward felt like a duty. And so the monastery became a quiet crossroads of knowledge, shaped by intention but also by circumstance. But not everyone saw it as harmless. Some nobles feared monasteries because they believed monks knew too much. Others worried that the church's intelligence web could be used against them. From time to time, accusations surfaced, claims that a monastery had encouraged one family over another, or had influenced a negotiation. Whether these accusations were true or simply products of paranoia does not change the underlying truth. Monasteries held a kind of power that did not depend on armies or wealth. They held the power of awareness. And then there were the monasteries, located near borders, especially between rival kingdoms. These became early listening posts. They watched travelers, noted troop movements, and quietly passed along warnings. A monk, writing in his journal, might record that soldiers from a distant region were gathering near a river. A letter could leave the monastery the next day, carrying that observation hundreds of miles away. Because border monasteries were not just spiritual centers, they were points of surveillance in landscapes where maps were incomplete and communication was slow. Even within the monastery walls, hints of this dual role appeared. In manuscripts copied by monks, tiny side notes sometimes contained political opinions or observations about nearby towns. Chronicle writers included reports of unrest or unusual events. Records of tithes showed economic changes. Letters from abbots displayed negotiations between church and crown. All these threads woven together reveal something clear. Monasteries were not passive. They were active participants in shaping medieval understanding. But here's where the story becomes especially interesting. Despite all this influence, monks rarely thought of themselves as spies. They believed they were fulfilling a sacred responsibility to maintain harmony. And in many ways, they were. Their reports warned rulers about famine, unrest, disease, and conflict information that could save lives. Their travel kept distant communities connected. Their observations provided a stability that political systems alone could not guarantee. Still, the duality remained. The monastery was both a sanctuary and a lookout tower, a place of prayer and a place of knowledge. And knowledge, especially in a world built on uncertainty, was the most valuable protection anyone could offer. So as we walk quietly through those stone corridors, hearing the soft echo of footsteps and the scratch of quills on parchment, we begin to understand why monasteries mattered so much. They were the quiet heart of a world filled with moving parts. They saw what others could not. They heard what others hid. And without intending to, they became the closest thing medieval Europe had to an organized intelligence network, one built not on secrets of warfare, but on secrets of human nature. As we leave the quiet stone corridors of the monastery behind, our journey takes us into a very different realm, one filled with armor, banners, coded rituals, and an organization that has captivated imaginations for nearly 1,000 years. The Knights Templar. Few names from medieval history inspire such a potent mixture of fascination, suspicion, and awe. They were soldiers and monks, warriors and bankers, holy men and political powerhouses. And while much of what people claimed about them in the Middle Ages was exaggerated or downright invented, the uncomfortable truth is that many conspiracy theories surrounding the Templars were not as delusional as later historians like to believe. Some were rooted in real power, real wealth, and real secrecy. Our story begins in the early 1100s, when the first members of the Templar Order formed a small brotherhood dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. At the time, the mission was simple: escort unarmed travelers along dangerous roads where bandits and rival armies roamed. Nothing about this beginning hinted at the enormous power the group would someday wield. They were not kings. They were not nobles. They were not part of elite dynasties. They were 9 men with swords and faith, little more. But in the medieval world, power had a way of gathering quickly around organizations that combined piety with discipline. And the Templars, with their stark white cloaks and austere vows, seemed to embody something Europe desperately wanted to believe: in purity, courage, and unwavering commitment. Soon, donations poured in: land, money, weapons, horse, entire estates. Nobles eager for salvation signed over property in exchange for the Templars' prayers. Merchants favored them. Kings protected them. And within a few decades, the small band of warriors had transformed into one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. The irony: power attracted suspicion long before it brought admiration. For villagers and peasants already overwhelmed by famine, taxes, and constant wars, the Templars' rapid rise felt unnatural, almost supernatural. Imagine standing in a medieval marketplace, hearing rumors swirling like smoke. They own castles across the continent. They have ships that sail without flags. They protect treasure hidden beneath Jerusalem. They hold secrets even the Pope cannot read. Some of these whispers were ridiculous. Some were purposeful exaggerations. But some just enough to fuel the fires contained threads of truth woven through the fantasy. Perhaps the most controversial truth was that the Templars created what might be considered the earliest form of international banking. Pilgrims traveling long distances often risked robbery if they carried large sums of money. The Templars solved this by offering a system where a pilgrim could deposit money in one Templar house in Europe and withdraw the equivalent amount in Jerusalem. They issued coded receipts, kept meticulous records, and protected their vaults with a level of discipline unmatched by secular institutions. This system transformed them from mere warriors into financial powerhouses. Kings borrowed from them. Merchants relied on them. And when an institution becomes the lender of last resort, its influence rises above crowns and armies. But power like this always casts a shadow, and secrecy necessary for preserving their rituals, their finances, and their discipline only deepen the mystery. The Templar initiation ceremonies were private. Their training was private. Their internal rules were private. Even the way they managed money was opaque to outsiders. In an age where ordinary villagers could not read, the sight of finely documented Templar records might as well have been sorcery. When people saw a group that acted differently, thought differently, and operated on a scale no one else could match, their imaginations filled in the blanks with fear. The most infamous rumor claimed the Templars worshipped a mysterious severed head they called Baphomet. In reality, this so-called head was likely a misunderstanding or deliberate slander, possibly referring to relics the Templars guarded or garbled interpretations of Eastern words they had encountered during their campaigns. But to medieval minds, complexity was not comfortable. Simplicity was a secret ritual, clearly something demonic. A hidden symbol, obviously a heretical idol. The more the Templars tried to maintain discipline, the more suspicious they seemed. The greatest twist in their story came during the reign of King Philip IV of France. Philip was a man perpetually drowning in debt. Wars drained his treasury. Ambition outpaced his resources. And the Templars, with their wealth and independence, stood as both a temptation and an obstacle. He needed money. They had it. He needed control. They refused it. So Philip devised one of the most brutal political strategies medieval Europe had ever witnessed. On a single morning, Friday the 13th, the day that would later fuel its own superstition, his soldiers executed synchronized raids on every Templar house in France. The charges were shocking. Heresy, blasphemy, indecency, forbidden rites, and treason. The confessions that followed were torn from the Templars under torture. Medieval torture. The kind designed not to discover truth, but to manufacture it. But here's where the conspiracy gets slippery. Many of the accusations were false, deliberate fabrications to justify Philip's seizure of Templar wealth. Yet, some elements had grains of truth. Not the supernatural parts, but the organizational ones. The Templars did possess treasure. They did run an international financial system. They did keep certain knowledge confidential. They did operate with unusual independence from kings and even from the Pope. And in medieval Europe, a group powerful enough to rival monarchs inevitably became a target. After the trials, after the executions, after the order was dismantled, rumors only intensified. People whispered that some Templars escaped with their treasure, that they carried secret documents out of Paris in the dead of night, that ships slipped away from French harbors before Philip's soldiers could seize them. And although much of this is folklore, the truth is that the Templar fleet mysteriously vanished from records. Completely. A final puzzle piece in a story already tangled with shadows. Why does all this matter? Because the Knights Templar reveal something essential about medieval conspiracy culture. Many conspiracies start with fear. But the ones that endure, the ones that capture imagination centuries later, survive because they contain hints of truth. The Templars were not sorcerers. They were not heretics. They did not worship hidden idols or summon forbidden powers. But they were secretive. They were wealthy. They were organized. They were international. They were independent in a world where independence was dangerous. And above all, they stood outside the traditional hierarchy in ways medieval peasants could not understand and kings could not control. That alone was enough to birth conspiracy. And when power collapsed suddenly, dramatically, and violently, people filled in the silence with stories. So tonight, as we walk through the echoes of abandoned Templar fortresses and sift through the remnants of their immense legacy, one lesson becomes clear. Sometimes conspiracies grow not from imagination, but from the places where truth and secrecy overlap. And in the medieval world, no organization lived in that overlap more dramatically than the Knights Templar. When we talk about medieval conspiracy theories, few moments in history burn as fiercely in the imagination as the Black Death. It was not just a disease, it was terror made visible. It arrived like a shadow that could not be outrun, a creeping threat that turned cities silent, emptied villages, and reshaped Europe more brutally than any war. But what made this period even more unsettling was not just the illness itself. It was the uncomfortable sense felt by peasants, merchants, and even minor nobility that someone out there knew more than they were saying. Tonight, as we follow the thread of medieval conspiracies that held surprising truth, we step into a world where fear spread faster than the plague and suspicion followed just behind it. Imagine a medieval port at sunrise. Ships drift in, sails heavy with salt and wind. Merchants unload crates of spices, wool, pottery, and grain. Dockworkers shout, fishermen mend nets. Children run along the pier. Nothing about this scene reveals the threat hidden in the holds of those ships: infected rats, fleas that carried unseen danger, and the first whispers of an outbreak that would soon devour entire kingdoms. But long before the villagers inland saw any sign of illness, something else began happening. Quiet letters passed between clerics, bishops quietly adjusting travel plans, monasteries locking their doors at unusual times. And people noticed, not because they understood disease, but because they understood behavior. A bishop who suddenly canceled a visit. A monastery that stopped accepting travelers. A noble family that packed belongings and moved to their countryside estate overnight. In a world where daily routines were rigid and predictable, any deviation meant something. The church, more connected than any institution of the era, stood at the center of this awareness. Their network stretched across Europe. Monasteries, dioceses, trading ports, scribes, priests, hearing confessions in every village. They corresponded regularly, shared news, exchanged reports. And in the early waves of the plague, they learned one vital truth before almost anyone else: it was spreading fast. Letters from Italian merchant cities described unexplained deaths. Chronicles from the East warned of entire towns collapsing. Reports from sailors mentioned strange fevers striking coastal regions. And although germs were not part of medieval vocabulary, patterns were. The church had access to those patterns. But did they share them? That question is where conspiracy took root. Because from the perspective of the ordinary villager, things did not make sense. Why did bishops leave cities before sickness appeared? Why did monasteries close their gates, refusing travelers who had always been welcomed? Why were sermons suddenly filled with warnings about divine punishment days before the first signs of illness reached the town? And then there were the coded messages. Letters written by clergy contained peculiar phrases like "a ship brings dark tidings" or "silence your gatherings until the air clears." To a medieval reader, these might have looked like spiritual metaphors. But today, when historians read them, they reveal something clearer: subtle warnings, shared only among those already in positions of power. Peasants saw none of this. They worked in fields, unaware that disease was already creeping along trade routes. They celebrated feast days. They attended markets. They gathered in taverns. And because no one told them otherwise, they stayed close together right when separation could have saved their lives. When the illness finally arrived, it struck like lightning. A neighbor coughing, a child feverish, a family struck within a week, a village half empty by the next. And all the while, people remembered how the clergy had acted days earlier. Suspicion bloomed. Did they know this was coming? Why did not they warn us? Why did they save themselves first? These were not modern questions. They were medieval questions, whispered around hearths, in markets, and outside shuttered churches. Of course, the church did not understand the plague scientifically. Many clergy believed it was punishment, moral decay, or corrupted air. They did not withhold cures. They had none. But what they did have was information. They knew which cities were reporting sudden deaths. They knew which monasteries had closed due to illness. They knew which ports issued warnings. And they shared that knowledge almost exclusively with one another, not with the public. Part of this was intentional. Medieval leaders feared panic. If peasants fled cities uncontrolled, crops would fail, taxes would not be collected, and chaos, far worse than plague, could consume the region. Order mattered, even when disease spread, even when death climbed the staircases of palaces and barns alike. And part of it came from uncertainty. Without a clear explanation, the church hesitated to speak boldly. They feared saying the wrong thing, almost as much as saying nothing. A vague warning delivered too early could spark riots, but a warning delivered too late was useless. So the silence continued, and peasants filled those silent spaces with their own explanations. Some blamed outsiders. Some blamed the heavens. Some blamed clergy themselves. And conspiracy theories, shaped by fear but sharpened by genuine observation, took hold everywhere. One early example comes from Venice. Merchants later wrote that they received private advice from church officials telling them to avoid certain harbors. The plague arrived in those same harbors a week later. That timing was not coincidence. It was information delivered selectively, in whispers, behind shutters. Another example comes from northern France, where monasteries fortified their doors, refusing entry even to local villagers who had relied on them for decades. Why close so abruptly? Because letters from southern ports had already warned them. But the villagers did not know that. They just saw locked doors during their hour of need. And then there is the most haunting detail. Some city gates were ordered shut before the plague reached the region. Officials claimed divine intuition, but records show that church messengers had arrived days earlier. Was this malicious? No. Was it self-preservation? Absolutely. And in the medieval world, self-preservation from those in power almost always looked like conspiracy from below. What makes this chapter especially gripping is how deeply it mirrors human psychology. When disaster strikes, we look for explanations. And when those explanations do not come, or when they come too late, we assume someone is hiding the truth. And in this case, medieval people were not entirely wrong. Clergy did know more. Elites did move early. Warnings did circulate privately. And ordinary people were left to face the storm blind. Yet irony hangs over this entire era. Even with their early knowledge, those same elites suffered catastrophic losses. Monasteries emptied. Entire bishoprics died. Nobles fell ill just as peasants did. The plague spared no one, not even the informed. And that leads us to the quiet, tragic heart of this conspiracy. The church did not hide information because they were villains. They hid it because they were terrified, overwhelmed, and unprepared, just like everyone else. Tonight, as we imagine the bells tolling over abandoned streets and cloisters filled with frightened monks, we see a truth that medieval peasants could not. The church's secrecy was not a sign of control. It was a sign of fear. The fear of being powerless in a world that demanded answers they simply did not have. But fear looks like conspiracy when viewed from outside, especially when information becomes a privilege instead of a lifeline. As the Black Death's shadow finally recedes from our path, we move deeper into the world of medieval secrecy, and now we find ourselves once again before the dark wooden doors of a monastery. But this time, we are not stepping in to learn about scribes or travelers or chroniclers. Tonight, we are entering for a different reason entirely. Because hidden behind the quiet chants, the illuminated manuscripts, and the serene courtyards was another role the monastic world played, one that few villagers ever suspected, and one that kings relied on far more than they publicly admitted. The medieval monastery was a sanctuary, yes, a place of prayer, a place of refuge. But power has a way of growing roots in unexpected soil, and monasteries were no exception. They were hubs of information, and where information gathers, influence follows. And where influence grows, someone somewhere begins using that influence to shape events, quietly, invisibly, without needing a sword or crown. When people today hear the phrase monastic enforcers, imagination leaps to cloaked figures slipping through shadows. But the truth is subtler, more grounded, and arguably more interesting. These were not dramatic killers moving by moonlight. These were monks entrusted with tasks that required precision, loyalty, and anonymity, missions that a nobleman or bishop could not risk assigning to soldiers or servants. Imagine a conflict between two noble families simmering just below the surface. Armies marching would draw attention. Negotiators might fail. A messenger could be intercepted. But a monk could walk between enemy territories without raising suspicion. He could carry letters, proposals, warnings, or ultimatums, hidden behind polite greetings and religious formality. His very appearance disarmed conflict, and that made him powerful. Now, imagine a monastery receiving a quiet request from a powerful lord. Discourage this man from pursuing his rebellion. The monk chosen for the task would not arrive with threats. He would arrive with words, soft, measured, persuasive. He would remind the man of obligations, salvation, community, reputation. Sometimes that was enough to change a mind, and sometimes that subtle pressure shaped the course of an entire region. Picture another scenario. A monastery discovers a minor noble is spreading rumors that threaten peace. A monk visits. They talk privately. The noble reconsiders his stance. Rumors die out. No one ever knows. The monk was sent at the request of the crown. In a world where reputation mattered as much as swordsmanship, a monk's visit was a form of political pressure so gentle it barely rustled the surface, but so effective it often prevented violence before it began. But there were cases rare, whispered about only in letters and chronicles, where monks were entrusted with missions that blurred the line between diplomacy and something darker. Not violence, not harm, but intervention. Imagine a document that needed to disappear. A witness who needed convincing to retract an accusation. A dangerous rumor that needed to be quietly corrected. A rival branch of a family that needed to be dissuaded from advancing a claim. A monk could step in, speak calmly, and leave without anyone suspecting involvement from a lord or bishop. Their neutrality was their greatest weapon. Monks moved through towns like ghosts, seen, acknowledged, and instantly dismissed as harmless. That invisibility made them perfect carriers of secrets. It made them perfect advisors in delicate negotiations. And yes, sometimes it made them perfect silencers, not of people, but of conflicts. One example comes from the chronicles of 13th century England, where an abbot quietly mediated between two barons preparing for open conflict. He arrived at one estate, spent hours in private conversation, left without fanfare, and rode to the rival's estate the next morning. Within a week, the conflict dissipated. No soldiers marched. No blood was shed. But letters reveal something else happened. Subtle pressure, veiled warnings, and delicate reminders of consequences, all delivered by a man in simple robes. Another story, this time from France, describes monks intercepting a letter that contained accusations against a bishop. The letter never reached its destination. Instead, the messenger was gently persuaded to abandon his mission, and the monastery handled the matter internally. Was this justice? Was it protection? Or was it quiet manipulation of information? In the medieval world, the lines blurred easily. And then there is the strangest account of all, a tale from northern Spain about a monk who allegedly traveled across the border to deliver a message of correction to a noble involved in exploiting church lands. Chronicles hint that the noble changed course immediately after the monk's visit. The monk's role, never formally recorded. But the timing speaks for itself. None of these stories describe violence. None describe harm. Yet all describe power, quiet, targeted, almost invisible power. And when a monk acted, he did not act alone. He acted on behalf of a network, a bishop, an abbot, a noble, a council. His robes were his permission. His vows were his shield. His anonymity was his strength. But were there monks who stepped even further into the shadows? Medieval rumors said yes. Tales spread about warrior monks trained in stealth, though most of these accounts were exaggerated or symbolic. The truth is more subtle. Certain monastic orders, especially those close to political borders, trained members in reading terrain, observing troop movements, and traveling safely through dangerous regions, not to fight, but to gather information, to warn allies, to serve as early warning systems. Think of them as medieval field operatives, collectors of knowledge rather than enforcers of force. Their tools were not weapons. Their tools were awareness, trust, observation, persuasion, and in a medieval political landscape held together by fragile alliances, those tools were more valuable than swords. But why did nobles trust monks with such delicate tasks? Because monks had no dynasties, no heirs, no ambition for land, no hunger for titles. A soldier might be bribed. A courtier might seek advancement. A noble might switch allegiances. But a monk, in theory, desired nothing for himself. That made him the safest messenger in Europe. Yet even as monks carried out these discreet missions, they remained invisible to the public. Villagers saw only the surface, the prayers, the chanting, the simple robes. They had no idea that the same man who blessed their children might also be delivering a quiet warning to a baron 2 valleys away. Over time, stories leaked. Rumors grew. People whispered about monasteries, reaching into affairs not their own. Some imagined secret councils hidden deep within cloister walls. Others spoke of monks who could topple a noble's ambitions with a handful of carefully chosen words. And although these rumors were often exaggerated, they were not born from nothing. They reflected a truth that medieval society instinctively recognized. Power wears many faces, and the most dangerous is often the one disguised as harmless. And so the legend of monastic enforcers took shape. Not killers, not spies in the modern sense, but quiet hands nudging the world in one direction or another. A monk stepping inside a noble estate was not always just a spiritual visit. Sometimes it was a course correction, a recalibration, a subtle reminder that someone, somewhere, was watching. And the beauty and danger of this form of influence is simple. No historian can ever fully record it. No chronicle explicitly names it. No document openly admits it, because the most powerful acts were performed gently, invisibly, under the protection of a vow and the silence of a hood. So tonight, as we imagine a monk riding alone along a narrow path, robes fluttering in the wind, carrying not scripture, but a quiet message that could alter a family's future, we understand something essential. In the medieval world, influence was rarely loud. It whispered, it traveled lightly, and sometimes it wore a simple robe. As we leave behind the subtle, invisible influence of monastic enforcers, our path leads us into one of the most misunderstood chapters of medieval life, a world where knowledge became danger, where healing became suspicion, and where ordinary women and men carrying ancient wisdom found themselves entangled in conspiracies they never meant to inspire. Tonight, we are stepping into the homes of midwives, the gardens of herbalists, and the quiet, secret gatherings where people met not to harm, but to survive. To understand why medieval witch hunt conspiracies took hold, we have to step into the lives of those who practiced the oldest kind of medicine, knowledge passed hand to hand, not written in books, not approved by the church, and not controlled by nobles or physicians. These healers, mostly women, sometimes men, were the backbone of rural life. When a child had a fever, people did not run to a physician. They ran to the herbalist. When childbirth turned dangerous, they called the midwife. When a villager suffered nightmares, anxiety, or unexplained pains, they sought help from someone who understood herbs, teas, smoke rituals, and calming words. These people were not witches. They were not sorcerers. They were not performing anything dark or forbidden. They were using the tools they had: plants, observation, intuition, and generations of experience. But in a world where the church feared losing influence, where elites feared losing control, and where unexplained events needed explanations, these healers attracted attention. Sometimes curious, sometimes admiring, and sometimes threatening. Imagine a midwife arriving at a cottage in the middle of the night. She carries a bundle of herbs tied in cloth, a bowl, a ladle carved from wood, and a soft voice. Inside, a woman struggles through childbirth. The midwife knows which leaves to boil to relax the mother's muscles, which oils to warm to ease pain, which prayers or chants to whisper words more comforting than magical. When the baby's first cry fills the room, the family praises the midwife, offering bread, cheese, or a small pouch of grain in thanks. But what the family does not see is that this knowledge did not come from books. It came from older women teaching younger ones, in kitchens lit by single candles. It came from herbalists collecting plants at dawn and sharing discoveries with each other. It came from generations living close to nature, noticing that one flower eased coughs while another helped headaches. It came from necessity. But necessary knowledge can become suspicious knowledge in a society built on strict hierarchies. The church taught that healing should come through prayer, priests, and divine intervention. University-trained physicians insisted that true medicine came from scholarly texts written in Latin. But most villagers could not afford a physician, and even if they could, physicians often refused to treat childbirth, mental distress, or skin conditions, leaving healers and midwives as the only ones willing to help. And so, quietly, an informal network emerged. Healers met on the edges of forests to share plants. Midwives exchanged notes on which remedies worked best. Herbalists kept small notebooks written in coded symbols or simple sketches to record discoveries. They created what was essentially a grassroots medical system, not organized like the church, not formal like universities, but functional, reliable, and deeply connected to the daily lives of ordinary people. The problem: this network existed outside official authority, and anything outside authority could be labeled dangerous. Rumors began as whispers. A woman who cured an illness viewed as God's punishment was whispered about. A midwife whose patients survived childbirth more often than others drew suspicion. A healer who understood plants that doctors could not identify became a subject of gossip. And when people encountered something they could not explain, an unexpected recovery, a ritual involving smoke or herbs, a chant spoken softly, they created explanations that fit their worldview. She must have special powers. She knows more than she should. She does things others can't. At first, these words were spoken with admiration. But admiration has a fragile edge, and that edge breaks easily when fear enters the picture. The transition from respect to suspicion often happened during difficult times. A bad harvest, a sudden fever in the village, a child lost to illness. People looked for someone to blame, and the same healers they once trusted became convenient targets. After all, if these women claimed to cure, why could not they prevent? If they understood herbs, did they also understand poisons? If they performed rituals to heal, could those same rituals be twisted into accusations of dark practices? The truth is simple. These healers had networks, but not secret cults as people imagined. Their gatherings were not covens. They were study groups. Their rituals were not spells. They were traditions. Their knowledge was not dangerous. It was practical. But the medieval mind often mixed unfamiliar knowledge with superstition. And when the church began preaching against superstitious women, the shift was complete. Confessions heard by priests added fuel to the fire. Someone might say, "I went to the healer for help," meaning only that they used herbs. But if the priest did not understand the remedy or feared it, he might interpret it as forbidden activity. And when multiple villagers confessed fears or suspicions about a healer, a narrative formed one that said these women worked outside divine approval. Thus, early witch hunt conspiracies took shape, not from malice, but from misunderstanding, ignorance, and fear of knowledge beyond control. One example comes from 14th century Germany, where a group of midwives met monthly to share birthing techniques. A visiting priest heard them chanting an old rhyme, one that simply helped them remember the order of procedures. But because the rhyme mentioned the moon and ancient symbols, he reported it as a ritual. The women were not punished, but they were watched closely afterward. Suspicion had taken root. Another example from northern Italy describes a healer who kept a small garden behind her cottage filled with rare plants. When a wealthy merchant's wife recovered from fever after drinking her herbal tonic, people praised her. But when 2 villagers later died from unrelated causes, some blamed her for meddling with nature. Her garden was searched. Her dried herbs were confiscated. The notes she kept simple drawings of. Plants were interpreted as coded spells. She was never accused formally, but her reputation never recovered. One of the most striking cases comes from France, where a healer's knowledge of sleep-inducing herbs helped ease pain for patients with chronic illness. Her remedies worked so well that local physicians, threatened by her success, spread rumors that her methods were unnatural. Soon, villagers whispered that she could control dreams. A wildly inaccurate interpretation, but fear rarely seeks accuracy. She fled the region before formal accusations could catch up to her. These stories show the fragile line medieval healers walked. Too much success could be seen as suspicious. Too much knowledge could be seen as threatening. Too much community trust could be seen as dangerous to those in power. And yet, these networks persisted. Quietly, carefully, secretly, though not by choice. They passed down knowledge in kitchens instead of classrooms. They taught daughters and nieces instead of students. They hid tools in cupboards and notes under floorboards. They treated patients at night to avoid scrutiny. They whispered herbal recipes instead of writing them openly. In doing so, they inadvertently created the very thing that later generations pointed to as evidence of secret societies, a hidden medical system built out of fear of persecution. But the secrecy was not born from dark intentions. It was born from necessity and survival. What we see when we trace their stories is that early witch hunt conspiracies did not arise out of thin air. They arose from real people who shared knowledge the powerful did not understand. They arose from networks that existed only because villagers needed help no one else provided. They arose because fear interprets what it cannot explain as threat. Tonight, as we imagine these women kneeling in their gardens at dawn, cutting mint and lavender with worn knives, preparing remedies with steady hands, and teaching each other near the glow of a hearth, we understand a truth medieval society often ignored. Knowledge itself is neither good nor bad, but the way people react to it can create legends, accusations, and entire eras of fear. And in the medieval world, fear had a long reach. As we leave the secret networks of healers behind, we step into a chapter of medieval life where rumor held more power than parchment, and where a single whispered name could alter the course of kingdoms. The medieval world was built on lineage. Bloodlines determined legitimacy, inheritance, loyalty, and the right to rule. A crown did not sit securely on a monarch's head because of ceremony. It sat there because a chain of ancestry said it could. But chains break easily in an era without photography, reliable records, or universal literacy. And when that chain cracked, even slightly, rumors rushed in like water through the hull of a ship. Tonight, we journey into the world of hidden heirs and royal impostors, one of the most dramatic and strangely believable conspiracy themes of the Middle Ages. Imagine a kingdom in the 1200s or 1300s. A ruler dies suddenly, an illness, a wound, a mysterious fever, or a disappearance during battle. News spread slowly, carried by dusty riders across dangerous roads. By the time the message reaches distant towns, days or weeks have passed. Not everyone hears the same version. Some hear the king was gravely wounded. Others hear he vanished. Others hear he survived and is recovering in a distant monastery. In a world without reliable news, uncertainty becomes the default. And uncertainty invites imagination. Now picture villagers gathering in a tavern, listening to a traveler say he heard the king was alive. Picture nobles whispering in private halls, asking whether a child born out of wedlock might now be a political threat or a political opportunity. Picture scribes writing contradictory entries in chronicles, each believing their source was the trustworthy one. This was the medieval information ecosystem. fragmented, chaotic, alive. And into this chaos stepped the specter of the hidden heir. Sometimes the rumors sprang from hope. A beloved ruler died unexpectedly, leaving the kingdom devastated. People refused to accept the loss and created stories to ease the pain. He did not die, they said. He fled to the forest. He waits in a monastery until the kingdom needs him. He survived, disguised, protected by loyal friends. Other times, the rumors sprang from fear. Rival nobles exploited uncertainty by claiming a forgotten or illegitimate heir existed somewhere. They spread whispers that a child who once vanished might return as an adult to reclaim the throne. In a world without written birth certificates, this was not impossible. Children could be smuggled away during conflict. Records could be lost. A castle fire could erase half a generation's documentation. A traveling merchant could claim that a boy he saw in a distant town had the eyes of a king. The most famous example, of course, is the legend of the princes in the Tower in England, two boys who disappeared after their uncle claimed the throne. For centuries, rumors insisted that at least one survived. Impostors appeared across Europe claiming to be the younger prince, and people believed them. Not because the claims were necessarily convincing, but because the alternative accepting the brutal truth felt too heavy to bear. Hope clings to any thread it can find. But stories like this were not rare. They happened everywhere. In Russia, claimants repeatedly appeared, claiming to be sons of Tsars who had supposedly died. In Portugal, men emerged, claiming to be King Sebastian, who vanished in battle. In France, peasants told stories of kings returning in disguise to walk among the poor. In Germany, a man once convinced an entire region that he was a missing noble who had fled his family years earlier. Villagers supported him. Nobles feared him. Documents were searched, testimonies gathered, but because medieval record-keeping was inconsistent, nothing could be proven quickly. And here is where the conspiracy deepens. Sometimes, the stories were true. There are real cases buried quietly in chronicles of nobles faking their deaths to avoid political threats. A few fled into monasteries, shaved their hair, and lived the rest of their lives under new names. Others escaped to the countryside and rebuilt small lives under the shadow of anonymity. There were even kings who disappeared temporarily during rebellion, leading their enemies to declare them dead. When they returned, the shock reshaped politics. These real events fueled fiction. If one noble could disappear and return, why not a king? If one heir could hide in a monastery, why not a prince? People in the Middle Ages were not irrational. They were responding logically to a world where identity was fragile and official truth was often unreliable. Consider how easy it was to impersonate someone. Most peasants never saw the king. Most nobles only met him once or twice in their lives. A man with the right features, clothing, and story could convince crowds. Add a few scars, a dramatic tale of survival, and a handful of supportive witnesses, and suddenly, a claimant became a movement. Villagers seeking stability rallied behind such figures. Nobles seeking advantage funded them. Clergy seeking influence validated them. And before long, a simple rumor could transform into a rebellion, a rising, or at the very least, nationwide confusion. One of the most striking aspects is how deeply people wanted these stories to be true. A hidden heir represented justice returning, wrongdoing undone, corruption punished. For oppressed villagers, he represented hope that someone noble and righteous would come back and heal the land. For rebellious nobles, he represented a weapon against tyrannical rulers. For priests, he represented divine intervention in politics. Even those who did not believe often played along. Doubt was dangerous in a world of shifting loyalties. Better to wait and see. Better to pretend. And yet, there is another side to this phenomenon. Royal families themselves exploited the idea of secret heirs. A ruler might hint at having a hidden child to intimidate rivals. A queen might whisper of a lost bloodline to cast doubt on a rival's legitimacy. Ambassadors spread misinformation abroad. And because news moves slowly, rumors could last for decades before being disproven, if they ever were. All of this created a medieval world where the line between truth and conspiracy was blurry, permeable, and constantly shifting. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: in the absence of verification, stories become reality. When villagers gathered to swear allegiance to an impostor, he became their king in all but name. When nobles backed a false claimant, his existence reshaped politics, even if his identity was false. When rumors of a hidden heir spread across borders, kingdoms made decisions based on fear of what might emerge from the shadows. So tonight, as we picture a dusty road leading into a town square where a stranger with familiar eyes claims a birthright he never had, or perhaps one he truly did, we realize how deeply medieval people lived in the space between truth and possibility. They were not naive. They were navigating a world where missing information was not the exception, it was the rule. And in that kind of world, a lost heir did not need to be real to be powerful. He needed only to be believed. As we step away from the drifting shadows of hidden heirs and royal impostors, our path leads us back once more to the monasteries, those quiet, stone sanctuaries that shaped so much of medieval life. But this time, we are not stepping into the chapel or the courtyard or the manuscript room where monks copied biblical texts. Tonight, we are stepping behind a door few people in the Middle Ages ever even knew existed. A door thick as a fortress wall. A door locked with iron. A door that led not to prayer or meditation, but to something far more provocative, knowledge that was never meant for every pair of eyes. The medieval monastery was more than a place of faith. It was a vault, a memory bank, a storehouse for ideas from centuries, long before Christianity ever arrived in Europe. And because monks were among the only people trained to read and write, they became, intentionally or not, gatekeepers of intellectual power. But the story gets deeper, because some knowledge they guarded was not copied or shared. It was hidden. Imagine walking down a narrow stone hallway, lit only by flickering torches. You hear the chants of monks echoing faintly behind you, but the sound grows softer as you descend into a quieter, colder part of the monastery. A monk with a ring of keys leads the way. His sandals whisper across the floor. He stops before a heavy wooden door reinforced with black iron bands. He unlocks it, one key for the outer bolt, another for the inner lock, and sometimes a third for the chest inside the room. You step into a small chamber that feels nothing like a library. There are no rows of shelves, no tables for reading. Instead, there are chests, boxes, bundles of parchment tied with leather cords, scrolls wrapped in cloth. Some items are labeled plainly. Others bear cryptic symbols. A few have warnings written in Latin, not to frighten, but to discourage curiosity. Non aperius, nisi, iusu abbatis. Do not open without the abbot's permission. This room is the Armarium Secretum, the secret archive. And every monastery had one. Some were large. Some were tiny. Some were nearly empty. Others overflowed with centuries of preserved thought, but all shared one purpose: to protect knowledge considered too dangerous, too confusing, or too unorthodox for general circulation. What was inside? Not grimoires or spellbooks, as later legends imagined. Nothing supernatural, nothing occult in the modern sense. Instead, something far more extraordinary. Fragments of civilizations long gone, ideas that challenged accepted doctrine, and works of science far ahead of their time. Here lay forbidden pagan writings, philosophers whose questions pressed too deeply into the nature of reality, fate, and the cosmos. Texts from Aristotle, Plato, and Stoic thinkers were stored here before being later approved by church scholars. Some were preserved quietly for centuries before being allowed back into scholarly life. Here lay early medical treatises, observations on illness, anatomy, and natural remedies collected from Greek, Roman, or Arabic scholars. Many contradicted medieval superstition. Some suggested natural explanations for disease. Others described advanced surgical techniques. Such texts were dangerous because they hinted that suffering had causes beyond divine will. Here lay scientific works, mathematics, astronomy, early physics, manuscripts that described planetary motion, texts that speculated about the shape of the earth, charts that tracked stars with a precision medieval villagers could never imagine. These works were not forbidden because they were wrong. They were forbidden because they were unsettling. Here lay heretical writings, not sinful stories or books of rebellion, but ideas that simply deviated from the church's official narrative. Manuscripts from sects long extinct, theological debates recorded before the church established uniform doctrine, letters questioning interpretations of Scripture. Some of these were preserved, not to endorse them, but to keep them from resurfacing. Why hide them? Because knowledge is powerful, and power, in the medieval world, had to be controlled. Most monks were allowed to copy harmless texts, psalms, moral stories, chronicles, but only a handful were permitted to read the forbidden ones. The abbot knew which texts were in the chamber. Often, a sub-librarian or archivist held the keys, but the younger monks almost never entered. Their curiosity was discouraged, their access restricted, not because the manuscripts contained explicit danger, but because ideas, even old ones, could disrupt the fragile stability of medieval belief. A text suggesting that the stars influenced harvest cycles might challenge sermons about divine intervention. A scroll describing Roman birth control. Herbs might clash with church teachings on family. A philosophical text arguing for the immortality of the soul in a non-Christian context might raise uncomfortable questions. Even a medical document explaining contagion could destabilize theological understandings of illness. So the books stayed in the dark, sometimes for safety, sometimes for obedience, sometimes simply because no one remembered they were there. But curious minds are timeless. Every century, there were monks who asked questions, monks who wanted to learn more, monks who were drawn to the locked room, not because they sought forbidden power, but because they felt the tug of human curiosity. And from time to time, under the permission of an abbot or driven by the confidence of their own intellect, they stepped inside. One monk in 12th century England secretly copied a fragment of a Roman medical text describing plant-based anesthesia. His notes later spread quietly through other monasteries, influencing real medical practice, even though the church had never officially approved the text. Another monk in Italy encountered, preserved Greek philosophy that challenged his understanding of fate. He wrote letters questioning predestination and free will. Those letters eventually sparked debates that lasted decades. In France, a scribe, transcribing an astronomy manual, found references to planetary movement that contradicted the simplified cosmology taught at the time. He did not reject the findings. He tried to reconcile them. His marginal notes reveal a mind wrestling with ideas far ahead of the century he lived in. And then there were the manuscripts saved not for scholarship, but for survival. During invasions, some monks gathered books deemed dangerous and hid them, knowing they would be burned if discovered. They were not preserving forbidden ideas, they were preserving memory. There are even records of monks secretly teaching pieces of this locked knowledge to trusted students. Not openly, not proudly, but quietly, carefully. Enough to spark change, but not enough to attract suspicion. And this is where conspiracy enters, not through fantastical legends, but through the simple fact that people outside the monasteries knew something was being hidden. Villagers saw monks carrying chests into cellars. Nobles heard rumors of secret texts. Merchants visiting monasteries saw locked doors and guards. And because they did not know what was inside, they imagined the worst or the most dramatic. Some whispered that the monks kept books of enchantments. Others believed they stored prophecies. Some said they hid treasures. Others thought they protected ancient secrets that could topple kings. The irony is that the truth, while less magical, was far more profound. They hid human thought, human questions, human attempts to understand the world. But the medieval mind, living in a world shaped by mystery and faith, saw secrecy and assumed conspiracy. And in a way, they were not wrong. The hidden libraries were conspiratorial, not in spirit, but in practice. A circle of educated men controlled access to knowledge, deciding what should be shared, what should be locked away, and what the world was not ready for. And so, tonight, as we imagine standing in that hidden chamber surrounded by the silent breath of parchment and ink, by the weight of countless forgotten voices, by ideas waiting centuries for rediscovery, we understand something subtle but powerful. Medieval conspiracies often were not about monsters or dark rituals. They were about knowledge. Who had it? Who did not? And who was allowed to know what? In the medieval world, ideas were dangerous not because they were magical, but because they were powerful. And in a society built on faith, stability, and hierarchy, power always had to be watched carefully. As we step away from the locked vaults of monastic knowledge, our path carries us south, toward the glittering, dangerous, endlessly complicated world of medieval Italy. Today, we think of Italy as a unified country, but in the Middle Ages, it was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, Siena, Pisa, Lucca, and many more. Each was a kingdom in miniature, ruled not by monarchs, but by merchant dynasties, wealthy bankers, or elected councils that often hid more than they revealed. These cities traded, schemed, negotiated, spied, and occasionally fought open wars, but far more often they waged quiet ones. Tonight, we are entering a world where parchment carried as much danger as swords, where couriers risked more than soldiers, and where intelligence, not strength, determined who rose and who fell. The medieval Italian city-state was an astonishing creation, dense with wealth, innovation, and political ambition. Streets were narrow, towers rose skyward like stone warnings, markets buzzed with traders from all over the Mediterranean, and every household seemed to belong to a faction. Florence had the Guelphs and Ghibellines. Venice had the Great Council and the Council of Ten. Milan had rival families, Visconti, sforza, each maneuvering every hour of every day. In this environment, information became the most valuable currency. A city's survival depended not just on armies, but on knowing what its neighbors were planning. And so each city built a system of espionage that was as advanced, subtle, and ruthless as anything the modern world later created. Imagine Venice, the great maritime republic, queen of the Adriatic. Beautiful canals, gilded palaces, shimmering markets. But beneath the masks and merchant ships lay something else. One of the most efficient intelligence systems in medieval Europe. Venetian spies were stationed in Constantinople, Cairo, Tunis, Sicily, and every major port in the Mediterranean. They sent coded reports back to the Doge and to the Council of Ten, a small, secretive group that wielded more power than any public office. These reports described troop movements, trade negotiations, prices of spices, the moods of rival rulers, even rumors overheard in taverns. Nothing was too small. Nothing was irrelevant. Now, picture Florence. Wealthy, proud, filled with families, Medici, Pazzi, Albizzi, whose rivalries shaped the city's destiny. Florence did not send spies abroad as much as it spied on itself. Private letters were intercepted. Conversations were overheard at church. Messengers were stopped on the road. Political opponents found themselves watched by unseen eyes. The city kept scribes whose job was to read letters, not intended for them, leaving no seal unbroken. Suspicion was ordinary. Secrecy was survival. And then there was Milan, with its warlike dynasties. Milanese spies crossed borders, disguised as merchants or pilgrims, arriving in other cities to gather military intelligence. They calculated the number of soldiers stationed at a fortress, mapped trade routes, and reported alliances that might threaten Milan's expansion. What made these espionage systems so effective was not just the existence of spies, it was the sophistication of the tools they used. The Italian city-states invented and perfected code. Real, complex code. Diplomatic letters between Florence and its ambassadors often used substitution ciphers. Venice created numerical codes requiring a separate key to decode. Milan used invisible symbols, dots placed in margins that signaled hidden meanings. Even more fascinating, ambassadors often carried two letters, one public letter listing polite diplomatic priorities, and a second hidden letter containing the real instructions, sometimes contradicting the first completely. Imagine being an ambassador, reading a cheerful letter telling another ruler of friendship and unity, knowing that hidden in your cloak is a second message instructing you to undermine that same ruler's coalition. This was politics in medieval Italy. Public warmth, private calculation, and the informants. Oh, the informants. They were everywhere. Tavern owners, sailors, scribes, priests, merchants, beggars, even servants in noble households. Information flowed like water. A merchant arriving from Genoa might be approached casually by someone in Venice asking how many ships Genoa was building. A steward working for a Florentine banker might pass ledgers to a rival family. A servant polishing silver in a noble home might overhear a conversation meant only for elite ears. None of this was dramatic. It was ordinary, expected, built into society. The cities also established secret councils, small groups of powerful men who met behind closed doors to review intelligence, plan covert missions, and approve acts that would never be written in official documents. Venice's Council of Ten became legendary for this. Their meetings were silent, their members chosen carefully, and their decisions rarely recorded. They handled cases of treason, espionage, and corruption, but also ordered discreet interventions, bribes, intimidation, quiet negotiations, and pressure placed exactly where it was needed. The most chilling and strangely modern part of this system was the use of anonymous reports. In Venice, citizens could slip letters into a stone mouth carved into walls. Bocca di Leone, the lion's mouth accusing others of wrongdoing. Some accusations were truthful. Many were vengeful. All were reviewed by the Council of 10. People lived knowing that at any moment, someone could report them anonymously, and that report could set in motion an invisible chain of investigation. This was not paranoia. This was civic design. Living in such a world meant living with the constant awareness that someone, somewhere, was always watching. But it also meant living in a world where political assassinations rarely happened publicly. Quiet sabotage was more effective. A letter intercepted, a trade agreement undermined, a diplomat removed through pressure, not violence. The shadow war kept cities stable on the surface while tension simmered underneath. One of the most dramatic examples is the Pazzi conspiracy in Florence, where rival families attempted to overthrow the Medici. While the attack itself was public, the planning behind it relied heavily on spies, informants, and secret negotiations with outside powers. Letters coded in symbols traveled through Rome, Milan, and Naples. Meetings happened in quiet rooms, behind churches. Every faction watched every other faction. And when the plot finally erupted, the shock was not that it happened, but that it had taken so long. Another example comes from Venice, which discovered a plot by a foreign power to destabilize the city by bribing ship captains. Venetian spies uncovered the scheme not through heroic infiltration, but through a tiny piece of information, a shipment arriving earlier than expected. Someone noticed. Someone asked. Someone reported. Shadow wars are not built on grand gestures. They are built on details. What makes this chapter of medieval history fascinating is not just the existence of espionage, but how deeply intertwined it was with normal life. The medieval Italian city-state did not distinguish between diplomacy and spying. The two were inseparable. An ambassador was a spy. A merchant was a spy. A scribe was a spy. A priest hearing confessions at a foreign court, he too could be a spy without ever calling himself one. And the people living in these cities knew it. They understood that beneath the elegance of architecture and wealth lay networks pulling invisible strings. They lived inside conspiracies, not fictional ones, but political systems built on secrecy. And because these conspiracies were real, they fed rumors and legends for centuries. Tonight, as we step through the silent courtyards of Venice or walk the narrow alleys of Florence under moonlight, we realize something vital. In medieval Italy, the most powerful battles were often fought without swords. The victories were won with letters, whispers, and shadows. Because in a world where knowledge was everything, the city that knew the most often ruled the longest. As we step beyond the stone palaces of Florence and the shadow war of the Italian city-states, our journey turns toward the people who lived on the margins of medieval society, communities who carried centuries of culture, learning, and spirituality, yet found themselves repeatedly navigating suspicion, discrimination, and danger. While nobles plotted and monks negotiated, these communities were creating something very different. Networks meant not to gain power, but simply to survive. Networks built in whispers. Networks sustained by trust. Networks shaped by necessity. Tonight, we walk beside Jewish and Muslim communities who quietly protected each other in landscapes that were often hostile, unpredictable, and frightening. To understand these networks, we have to step into the shoes of people whose lives were marked by uncertainty. A Jewish family living in a European town in the 12th or 13th century might face sudden changes in law, unexpected taxes, restrictions on movement, or accusations sparked by rumor. A Muslim merchant traveling through Spain or Italy might find himself treated warmly in one region and unwelcome in the next, depending on politics or religious tensions. For both groups, danger did not announce itself with banners. It arrived quietly, sometimes overnight. And so they built systems of protection that ran beneath the surface of everyday life. Imagine a traveler arriving in a market at dusk. He blends into the crowd, buys bread, listens to local chatter. But he is also watching, searching, not for danger, but for signals, tiny details others would overlook. A mark near a doorway, a lantern hung in a particular way, a pattern of stones placed beside a well. These subtle signs told him where safety was, where he could sleep, where he could find others who would help him if needed. No written map guided him. No public announcement told him where he belonged. Instead, he relied on a web of quiet connections formed over generations. This was not espionage. It was not conspiracy. It was survival. Jewish communities, especially, lived with laws that could change depending on the whims of local rulers. In some places, they were protected. In others, they were restricted. In rare cases, they were expelled. So families learned to move silently. Letters traveled between towns, alerting relatives about danger. Traders whispered advice at border crossings. Merchant caravans carried not just goods, but warnings. Do not stop in that village. Pass through this city before nightfall. Avoid the road near the river. Soldiers are searching for outsiders. Some towns had designated safe streets, alleys, where Jewish travelers could find shelter in unknown cities. People opened their homes quietly at night. Windows flickered with candles placed in certain patterns to signal safety. These signals were not written anywhere. They were taught through community, memory, mother to daughter, father to son. To outsiders, these patterns seemed mysterious, perhaps even suspicious. But to those who understood them, they were lifelines. In Muslim communities, especially those traveling through Europe for trade, similar systems emerged. Muslim merchants carried spices, silk, perfumes, knowledge, stories, and sometimes scientific texts. They traveled through Christian lands, where politics shifted often, and where being misidentified could be dangerous. So they built networks of khans and safe inns, places run by people who understood their customs. They used coded phrases to identify trustworthy allies. They left small marks on road posts to guide the next traveler. They mapped safe wells, friendly markets, and neutral towns more accurately than any official map maker. These systems grew, not because they sought hidden power, but because they existed in a world where protection was never guaranteed. And then there were the routes. Invisible routes that wound through forests, mountains, and river crossings known only to those who needed them. Some were migration paths used when expulsion orders came suddenly. Others were trading routes built to avoid hostile checkpoints. A few were escape routes used during pogroms or conflicts. These were not grand corridors carved into rock or tunnels beneath cities. They were simply paths held in collective memory passed through stories, songs, and coded instructions. Imagine a family preparing to leave a town overnight. They pack only essentials: bread, water, a few coins, a cloth bundle of memories. A neighbor quietly delivers instructions. Follow the road past the mill. Turn when you see the broken willow. Cross the old bridge. There will be a house with a blue shutter. They will help you. No one writes it down. Because in that world, writing is risk. Memory is safety. Outsiders who glimpsed these quiet movements, people entering homes at odd hours, families relocating quickly, travelers speaking in lowered voices did not understand the context. They interpreted it as plotting, secrecy, even subversion. And so conspiracy took hold. Medieval chronicles sometimes described secret gatherings among Jewish or Muslim groups. Priests warned parishioners about coded conversations. Officials reported that these communities knew things before others did, as if possessing intelligence were an act of wrongdoing. But what they truly possessed was communication. Knowledge shared for survival, not to undermine kingdoms, not to challenge faith, simply to protect their families. One Jewish chronicler from Spain wrote of women who passed messages through markets. By the way, they folded their aprons, each fold signaling something: danger, safety, time to leave. A Muslim traveler from North Africa recorded how merchants used rhythmic knocks on inn doors to identify themselves, ensuring they would not be turned away in foreign lands. A rabbi in France wrote letters using coded Hebrew phrases to describe political unrest so the messages could pass safely through Christian messengers. A healer in Sicily kept records of families who needed assistance, using a simple star symbol to mark those who had recently fled persecution. The more interconnected these networks became, the more they were misunderstood. Medieval villagers saw only the secrecy, not the fear behind it. Authorities saw organization, not vulnerability. Clergy interpreted protective communication as whispered alliances. And once suspicion took root, it did not matter that the intentions were peaceful. The existence of any hidden system, no matter how innocent, became a canvas for others to project fear onto. But look closely, and the deeper truth becomes clear. These networks were acts of resilience. They preserved communities through centuries of uncertainty. They carried languages, food, customs, stories, knowledge, and family lines across continents. They kept hope alive in places where hope was fragile. They allowed people to survive in lands where their presence was tolerated one day and questioned the next. Tonight, as we imagine travelers moving gently along torchlit roads, guided not by maps but by memory, knocking softly on doors they hoped would open, watching for signals only they understood, we see that their secrecy was not conspiracy. It was humanity. A quiet, steady determination to endure in a world that did not always welcome them. And when people misunderstand survival as plotting, fear creates stories of hidden agendas, secret alliances, unknown powers, stories that overshadow the truth simply because they offer simpler, louder explanations. The reality was much quieter. Communities building lifelines in the dark. Families helping families. Strangers helping strangers. And knowledge passed forward because someone, somewhere, might need it someday. When people imagine medieval Europe, they often picture stone walls, royal decrees, and a society where everything was rigidly controlled from above. Taxes were collected, laws were proclaimed, guilds set prices, and the church dictated moral order. But beneath this carefully painted surface pulsed something far more flexible, far more human, and far more honest: the shadow economy. Not a sinister underworld in the modern sense, but a parallel system of exchange, trade, negotiation, and survival that filled the enormous gaps left by official structures. It was the economic bloodstream of everyday life, invisible to rulers but essential to the people who lived in the margins of law and necessity. To enter this world, imagine yourself stepping into a medieval town at dawn. The cobblestones are slick from last night's rain. Smoke drifts from chimneys. Merchants at the main square begin setting up their stalls. Everything looks orderly, at least at first. But Follow the alleys behind the baker's shop or listen closely to the murmurs in the tavern before sunrise, and you will discover the truth that medieval people understood instinctively. The legal market was the performance. The shadow market was the engine. The first players in this underground world were the thieves' guilds. Unlike the romanticized gangs of novels, these guilds were not glamorous. They were practical. Organized groups of pickpockets, burglars, street scouts, and fence dealers who managed territory, settled disputes, and kept records far more meticulously than many noble households. Medieval law enforcement was so inconsistent that thieves had to create their own internal rules simply to avoid chaos. No stealing in another thief's territory. No targeting powerful families unless ordered. No killing unless absolutely necessary. Punishments were swift: exile from the district, repayment in goods, or in extreme cases, a disappearance that no chronicler would ever dare mention. But thievery was only one branch of the underground system. The real heart of the shadow economy was not theft, it was smuggling. Salt smuggling alone could feed an entire town's livelihood. Salt was heavily taxed, making it one of the most profitable items to transport secretly. Smugglers carried sacks under cloaks, floated barrels down rivers at night, or slipped through forest paths known only to those born into the trade. Wine, wool, spices, metal, ink, and grain also moved through unofficial channels. The moment a king raised a tax, smugglers turned it into opportunity. Imagine a medieval village during harvest season. The grain inspector arrives, demanding that a portion be surrendered as tax. But the villagers have already hidden much of it in underground pits lined with straw. A few sacks are offered publicly. The rest are quietly routed through a network of neighbors, passed from farm to farm, until they reach a trader who loads them onto wagons for the next town. These are not criminals. They are people trying to survive. A system that rarely cared whether they lived or starved. Then there were the unlicensed moneylenders, often operating in the back rooms of taverns, apothecary shops, or even monasteries. Official doctrine insisted that charging interest was sinful, but medieval people needed loans for seed, equipment, emergencies, dowries, or simply to get through a harsh winter. So a quiet system developed. A baker lent coins to a blacksmith. A miller financed a farmer's new plow. A monk who copied manuscripts by day provided discreet letters of credit by candlelight at night. Some lenders charged fair rates. Others exploited desperation. But everyone participated, because the official economy, slow, rigid, moralizing, offered no alternative. As the day warms, the marketplace fills with customers. But watch closely. The fish sold at full price by the dock are not the only fish entering the town. A fisherman late to the market hands his catch to a teenage boy who slips away into the alleys, selling the fish door to door without paying stall fees. A butcher stretches his meat with cheaper cuts hidden from view. A baker mixes lower quality flour to save coin. A cloth merchant sells smuggled dyes at night to avoid guild regulations. Everyone bends the rules a little, because the official rules were written by people who did not have to obey them. At night, the marketplace transforms entirely. The official stalls close. The church bells fall silent. And the black market begins. Under a stone arch behind the town granary, vendors gather by torchlight. Here, people trade things. The law forbade or heavily regulated foreign fabrics, rare herbs, tools imported without taxes, spices that arrived through illicit channels, or simply everyday goods sold without guild permission. It is not a den of crime. It is a community of people who cannot afford the legal system's limitations. Farmers exchange produce without license. Widows sell small items for coin. Journeymen, craftsmen, create goods in secret because guild laws restrict what they are allowed to make publicly. No one calls it illegal. They call it living. Even inns and taverns became hubs of hidden commerce. A merchant too embarrassed to borrow publicly meets a lender over warm ale. A smuggler passes a sealed pouch to a baker who will hide it in flour sacks. A messenger from another town delivers news about tax inspections or political unrest information worth far more than gold. The tavern is where deals were whispered, rumors were traded like currency, and alliances quietly formed between people who understood that the official economy could collapse the moment a noble ran out of coin. Farmers and villagers also created their own under-the-table systems. Bartering replaced coin when taxes became unbearable. Families exchanged eggs for cloth, wool for medicine, and tools for help with harvest. None of it touched the formal economy. None of it could be taxed. And none of it was discussed openly, though everyone participated in it. In bustling cities like London, Florence, and Paris, the shadow economy became almost an institution. Entire neighborhoods specialized in unregistered trade. Some operated as gray markets, neither fully illegal nor fully legal. A ship captain quietly unloaded crates before paying customs. A noblewoman bought luxury goods off the books to avoid scrutiny. A monastery sold wine without recording every barrel. Medieval people lived in a world where paperwork did not exist, receipts were not standardized, and rules were flexible depending on who enforced them. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this underground system was how openly people pretended it did not exist. Everyone from peasants to nobles participated in their own way. Everyone tolerated it, because it filled the gaps left by kings who issued decrees they did not understand, by guilds that protected wealth instead of skill, and by officials who taxed more than they governed. The shadow economy was the real economy, and everyone knew it. It thrived not because people were immoral, but because the world they lived in demanded creativity. Laws were rigid, life was not. Survival required adaptation, negotiation, and quiet defiance. And so, when you hear medieval chroniclers speak of crime, deception, or dark dealings, remember, what they really witnessed was life. A society building its own solutions in the spaces where official structures failed. A world that lived not just under kings and bishops, but under neighbors, friends, whispered agreements, and shared survival. The shadow economy was not sinister. It was human, and without it, medieval Europe would have collapsed long before the Renaissance began. And so, after wandering through royal kitchens filled with paranoia, forest rituals whispered under moonlight, monks who doubled as intelligence officers, knights whose wealth sparked centuries of rumors, and underground networks that helped persecuted communities survive, we arrive at a simple truth. Medieval Europe was never the predictable, rigid world described in textbooks. It was alive, messy, fearful, ingenious, contradictory, and endlessly human. Behind every official structure lay a hidden layer of reality, a second world made of quiet deals, whispered warnings, and secret knowledge. And what makes these stories so compelling is not just the conspiracies themselves, but what they reveal about the people who lived through them. Whenever medieval communities felt powerless, they created their own systems. Secret healers, when official medicine failed. Hidden escape routes, when authority turned hostile. Shadow economies, when taxes became unbearable. And coded networks, when truth could not be spoken openly. Even the most unbelievable legends often had a kernel of truth buried inside them. And perhaps that is why medieval conspiracy theories never truly died. They were not fantasies, but reflections of a world where survival depended on paying attention to the things nobody dared discuss aloud. If there is one lesson hidden beneath all these stories, it is this: history is not just shaped by kings, armies, and institutions. It is shaped by ordinary people, fearful, clever, hopeful, and determined, who built invisible bridges beneath the official world. And sometimes it is those hidden threads that tell the truest version of the past. Thank you for spending your time with me tonight, walking through the shadows and secrets of a world far older than us but strangely familiar. If you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to keep exploring history's quieter corners together. Take care, rest well, and I will see you in the next story.